At the heart of what we're doing with inferential statistics is sampling and probability. And previous classes we said that descriptive statistics do what? Characterize and summarize, right? Okay. And the inferential statistics, literally what's happening is we're looking at patterns and asking or trying to answer the question, what's the probability of getting this pattern just on the basis of normal random probability, just on the basis of random fluctuation? And if that probability goes really, really low, then we might have reason to think, okay, there's something other than normal random probability influencing the numbers in the situation. Sampling and samples, I posted some videos to look at between now and July 5th, and sampling is kind of tricky. Okay. Sample indicates that we're taking a subset of a whole population. One of the questions that we typically ask about that sample with respect to the population is, how well does it represent that population? And with a lot of research, this is going to be the limitation. Okay? That we took a sample, and to a certain degree, we feel that it represents the target population, the population to which we're trying to extend the results of our research, but there's some limitations. I'll give you a real quick example of that if we're doing research on campus here. A lot of times we do the research, we're trying to say, okay, we found something that's going to apply to everybody. Dr. Walsick does that with that lie detection research. You know, he finds things and says, okay, we think that the population on this campus, in terms of how they will physiologically respond to high cognitive load levels, is going to be similar to the rest of the population. Okay? Even though we have kind of a restricted population, the majority of the people that we're going to be working with in studies are going to be 18 to 24 years old, and not truly representative of the whole population. Okay? Slightly more female, a whole lot better educated in the population on average, and there's other things too that you could find in terms of looking at a population of tech, which is going to kind of eliminate the idea that this population perfectly resembles the whole United States, the whole world. Right? If we're going to do sampling, let's say at Tolliver Hall, and I'm surveying people, let's say outside of Tolliver Hall between 8 and 10 in the morning and between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, those could be different samples. They could be slightly different populations, even though we'd say, okay, this is representative of the student population. So what we try to do is try to find a sample that's going to work for our experimental needs. The descriptor that we often hang on using a university sample is we have a sample of convenience. That is, we sampled the people that were available, were readily available to be able to participate in our research. So, random sample, every member of the population has an equal chance of being in the sample. Okay? And realistically, the only way we're going to achieve this, use another unethical example, is we go drive around in a windowless van and we randomly take people off the street, throw the bag over their head, pull them in the van so they can participate in our research. Okay? This is kind of an ideal. If you're doing survey work with the United States government, you might actually have a random sample of something, where you've sampled the whole population, and then you can say, okay, I want every 300th person, or I want every 1,000th person. That could be a random sample. When we're running subjects on a college campus or in most laboratory settings, we don't have a random sample. What we end up with is that convenience sample. Who's available to participate in the research. This idea of external validity, that is, to whom or how far do our results generalize, to what populations? That can be problematic if you don't have a representative sample. Okay, with using university population, we've got a slightly smarter population, we've got a slightly healthier population. We tend to, even though the counseling center and some of the other mental health services or counseling providers, we'll see a lot of people with anxiety disorders. The mental health or the functioning of people in a college setting is usually a whole lot higher than the average population. The age range, restricted. With respect to tech, we're largely a white campus, so we can't say that, okay, if we're going to say that 25% of the U.S. population is non-white, We don't have that kind of representation there, although I think we're getting close. Somebody produced something where 7% of the population, 8% of the population on campus, African American. Volunteer self-selected sample. This is if you're doing a survey. This is how this could play out where you're not going to get everybody responding. Likewise, if you're doing research on a college campus, who are the participants? The participants are often people that are volunteering either because they're really interested in psychology or because they need that extra credit to raise the grade in some class. So some examples here. Course evaluations collected in a class and posted by a department online, evaluations of instructors and courses on independent sites like ratemyprofessor.com. Which one would you have more confidence in?
Rate my professor.
Okay. I could see it either way.
Yeah.
And I think what you see in sites like this is that the people that really liked a class
Or really hated it.
or hated it, yeah, you get that kind of extreme.
But with the course evaluations, I know that a lot of people, they just don't care, so they just go through and
Yeah,
they just
that's
they just put all A's or they just put all 5s or whatever instead of actually going through and reading it. Whereas, the rate my professor, it's more voluntary.
Yeah.
Like it's not required, it's more voluntary, they can go write whatever they want.
and people will post opinions too.
Exactly, and they can do like the thumbs up or thumbs down if they agree or not, and so I feel like that one would be better in my opinion.
Okay. That's why I said I could see it either way. I think Nolan Heinzen used this example in the text. I think the idea is, well, everybody got sampled here versus this is a smaller subset. I would see it as kind of apples and oranges, where like you're saying that what happens with this is if people didn't have any problems with the class, they're just
Right.
yeah. So
But then the other one could be kind of like Yelp, where like you said, people only put it if they're put reviews if they really like it or if they really hate it. Because if they're mad, people are like, I'm gonna go write you a bad review. But then if they really like you, I'm gonna take time to write you a review. But if it's just okay, they don't really comment.
I feel like that's better.
Like I only comment on reviews when they're bad, just because I usually get mad.
it's kind of like when people rate stuff for Amazon too. I've noticed that sometimes people will give, they really like the product, and other people are upset because of how it was delivered, or that it was late getting to them, or the package was damaged, or something like that, and giving it 1 star when in fact it had nothing to do with the product itself.
Right.
Limitations with convenience samples. With any kind of research that's having some kind of meaningful impact, what will happen is other people will try to duplicate that research. So let's say on a one-time basis where there's a study that's done with a university population, somebody else might replicate it with a different university population, with a different population altogether. So duplication of scientific results, ideally in a different setting, context, with a sample that's either slightly or completely different. And if you find the same pattern of findings, well, it kind of supports whatever that research was supposed to support. Random assignment. Okay, we don't have random sampling here, right? We're not, even on campus, we're not walking around, you don't see Dr. Walsick walking around with a burlap bag, taking people off the lab. So what he does is he has people that show up, and in order to make sure that the groups at least are representative of that population that showed up to become part of the sample, is that everybody is randomly assigned to one of however many conditions. So in other words, with that, if I was going to do that unethical study with the vodka and the Benadryl, 4 conditions: Benadryl, no Benadryl; alcohol, no alcohol. So I've got 4 different conditions there. I have 100 people show up, and to make sure that I don't have any biasing effects, or that I wash out whatever differences are in the group, I randomly assign each of those 100 people to one of those 4 conditions. So I got 4 groups of 25, which should be, in terms of their characteristics, should be fairly similar. Random assignment used, could it have been? And there's going to be limitations to stuff we do, especially when we get to talking about quasi-experimental research or correlational research. Health psychologists examined whether postoperative recovery time was less among patients who received counseling prior to surgery. than among those who did not.
I guess it could, but it's not practical. I guess.
And the other thing that creeps into the picture here is an ethical issue. If, let's say, the pre-surgery, the counseling prior to surgery, is seen as being beneficial or potentially beneficial, and it doesn't have any harmful side effects.
And you can't deprive other people.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be like, okay, we came up with we've discovered some non-toxic chemical that can cure terminal cancer. We think it could cure terminal cancer. We're not gonna have a control group and a treatment group. We're gonna treat everybody if we think it's gonna work.
But okay, I forgot when, it was like in the 70s or 80s or something, it was like for AIDS research, didn't they, I don't even think medicine turned out to be all that beneficial, but didn't they deprive some people of it? Do you know, are you
I'm
familiar?
vaguely recalling a study like that where there was a placebo group.
There was I saw a movie, so I don't know how accurate it was, but,
Yeah.
and he was like so mad, and, I mean, it was loosely based on a true story, but I didn't actually like look into it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it seemed like it was like this first drug, it wasn't FDA approved yet, and so it was like, to get it approved, they had to do this test, but it was AIDS, so it was terminal, so
Mm-hmm.
it was like, they brought up the debate, like, should everybody get it, but at the time, I don't think that they were.
Mm-hmm. I think what that would have been.
I forgot the name of it. I saw it in Dallas Buyers Club, the movie with Matthew McConaughey, but he plays, it's like based on a true story,
Yeah.
he like
Yeah.
does that like clinic where he administers it. I can't remember the name of it though,
Okay.
or if they still.
I
do
have
it.
yet to see that, but I'm gonna have to see it one of these days.
It was good. I really liked it.
Yeah, there was another movie, I'm trying to think what it was called, it was on HBO years ago, and the band played on, which looked at some of the mistakes that they made at the beginning of that when they weren't treating people, and then some of the ethical concerns once they had treatments identified. Number 2, a clinical psychologist studied whether people diagnosed with personality disorder were more likely to miss therapy appointments than people without diagnosed personality disorder. Well, no random assignment here, right? Because you're comparing these two groups. And in this case, this would be ethical because, you know, you've got two sets of records. You've got their psych eval records, and then you've got whether or not they made their appointments. Some things that tend to happen, especially during election years. I mean, we talk about these things in research, but if you think about people processing all the information with the candidates, and one of the things I think that kind of characterizes the American political landscape is that people have a tendency to identify as either liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican, and then they look for anything that reinforces their point of view. I think that's kind of unfortunate. Well, we talk about those things in cognitive psych and talk about how people process information. Confirmation bias or intentional tendency to pay attention to anything that supports our pre-existing ideas or beliefs while ignoring evidence that refutes those beliefs. And to a certain degree, we're all kind of guilty of this, even when we're trying to stay on top of things. Okay. And then illusory correlation, you know, believing that there's a relationship between two things when in fact there isn't a relationship. I'm going to post a link to a website that has a lot of interesting illusory correlations where you can go out there and you can, you know, if you find the numbers and start looking, you know, you can find numbers where there's matching patterns in terms of how they move, and you can create some kind of correlation. My favorite one that I mentioned last time in class was Nicolas Cage movies, Mass Murders. Did he make another movie this year?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't keep up.
I have to take a look at that. If there's
Maybe.
a movie that preceded what happened in Orlando by 3 months. Because if that happens, that correlation is going to seem intact.
Oh, I found the drug. It was AZT.
AZT, so protease inhibitor.
Right.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure that was the one that was up for debate in the story.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when they started doing the research on that, they understood enough about the biochemistry of retroviruses to have a strong theory that that would actually block the replication. Okay. So, yeah, under those circumstances, if you were going to try to research something, the way that you might research something like that would be doing, and this is something, I'll mention it briefly, we'll talk about this in later class, within subject design, where you monitor some condition or something that the disease causes. And this is how they do a lot of the cancer research too. is blood work indicators or presence of cells or malignant growths, and then start people on the medication and watch for those indicators to change. So they'll do something that could be a time series. So they're monitoring, let's say, the size of a tumor or something. Introduce medication to patient 1, tumor decreases. Patient 2, same type thing, tumor decreases, and there you've got your evidence, because what you would see is kind of a consistent pattern across participants that something would change. Personal probability, we all do this, estimate the likelihood of an event, also known as subjective probability, or we could say conditional probabilities. Look outside, what's the likelihood that it would rain? Well, the maximum probability, either rain or not rain, 50-50. Okay? And then we factor in other things, right? Oh, there's dark clouds on the horizon, even without looking at weather.com. Dark clouds on the horizon, or we feel certain temperature changes. Say, okay, that probability that's going to rain goes up a little bit more. The probability, this is that conditional probability, likelihood of particular outcome occurring out of all possible outcomes. Although there's one thing that we have to be careful with, and that's something that's known as gambler's fallacy. Y'all familiar with that?
With what?
Gambler's fallacy?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That, and this happens with research too, that every time, if let's say it's just going to be equal probability, every time we start over, the probability of something occurring is always going to be the same. So the probability with Powerball tickets or slot machines or roulette wheels is always the same, but some people say, or think, okay, I'm losing here, my luck has to change.
Right.
And with each trial, your luck remains the same. Expected relative frequency probability, likelihood of an event occurring based on actual outcomes of many trials. That is, we've kind of looked at the conditions, we know what the probability of something occurring given what we've already observed happening within that environment. Okay. Calculating the probability, determine the total number of trials, determine the number of the trials that are successful outcomes, and divide the number of successful outcomes by the number of trials. So in other words, if you were going to roll the dice, what's the probability that's going to come up 6? Well, if it's, let's say, it's also going to be 1 in 6. So if we're going to do 5 trials, what's the probability that it's going to come up 5 times in a row, or something like that? And the idea is it would be 1/6 times 1/6 times 1/6 times 1/6 times 1/6, whatever that ends up being. Okay, the gambler's fallacy. The woman has been playing on a slot machine without success for 2 hours, and she's just quit. Let's play that big one. It's going, or let's play that one. It's going to pay off soon. Yeah. And if you go over to Shreveport or Bossier and you watch what happens when somebody's been sitting in a machine for a long time, gets up and leaves. Somebody else will be right back in that seat, and other machines will be unoccupied. I mean, people actually think that's going to happen. Those machines are set up so the probability of them paying out is also going to be roughly the same. So in other words, I think what they refer to as what is it? They call it loose slot machines, and the probability of them paying out is going to be about 3%, but you don't know if it's going to pay out the first time or the 10,000th time, because it should be totally random, or totally random, but set so that it pays out 43% of the time. Next door neighbor has 3 boys and she's pregnant again. It has to be a girl. I've watched couples do this one. We had 2 boys, let's try again. Let's see if we can have a girl.
My cousin did that. She had a boy, and then the third one she got pregnant. She was like, "Oh, it's a girl. I just know it." Nope, it's a boy.
Yeah.
And she's gonna keep the crown, she said, till she gets a girl. So.
Well, good luck, because my next door neighbors have 9 girls and no boys. 9.
I know we tell.
How?
I don't know. We tell her the same thing.
9
We're like,
girls.
"You're just gonna keep having boys. I hate to tell you."
Yeah, in theory, the probability would be 50-50, but there's some physiological effects where male fetuses are like 1 to 2% less likely to be carried to term. So So the 9 girls slightly makes more sense, but the probability of having 9 girls in a row, that's very low probability.
There's a family that they had 9 boys and they just had their 10th one was a little girl.
That's good.
So it's possible. I mean, to have that many and then all of a sudden just bam.
Yeah.
So,
I'm picturing what that house has to look like. That house has to get bigger and bigger. And those are also the situations too where I think a lot of times you'll have one parent out there working 60, 80 hours a week to support everything. You need one person full-time at the home to take care of everything.
Yeah.
It can't be done, but not easy to go that route. Woman has been playing, okay, PLC, okay, never mind. What's that? Okay, so that idea that something is going to change, that is the gambler's fallacy, the mistaken notion that the odds are going to change at some point just because they've been running a certain way. But the idea here is that each time you're resetting everything, you're doing what's called sampling with replacement. Everything goes back to the original conditions, and the probability is going to be the same. Probability ratio is 1 to 0 or 0 to 1, and which is how we state our alpha level. Probabilities are often long-run patterns, but there's no guarantee of what's ultimately going to happen. Well, we use probabilities in hypothesis testing. I'll just ask, how much of this remains after you had PSYC541? Dr. Sheets had to talk a bit about this.
Yeah.
So what we're looking at is, if we get patterns, let's say we have some kind of theory or hypothesis, and we get patterns that are really low probability, we're likely to conclude that we have something that isn't just a random event. And if we can replicate that and get that same low probability pattern again with, running that same experiment with slightly different participants or a different setting, it confirms or builds support for whatever we think that non-random event is. Rules of probability are used to test hypotheses and to make decisions. So with hypothesis testing, the default is always going to be the null hypothesis. Anytime you're setting up some kind of study, the idea is that the default, what you're expecting is that there isn't going to be a difference. And what you're hoping for, if you're doing the research and set everything up and you think you've designed a good experiment, you've got some decent participants for your sample, is that you'll find a difference. So the research hypothesis, there is a difference. Okay? And control group, if we're going to do a true experiment, we're going to have a control group. We're going to have people that resemble the rest of the participants in that study that aren't going to have receive any kind of treatment or any kind of experimental condition. And then the experimental group receives the treatment. And the idea here is if this one is different than this one, then you can say that, okay, we think that what we did here caused the difference. And this is going to be what differentiates experimental research from non-experimental research. Experimental research is where you think you establish causality. With non-experimental research, yeah, the difference might be there and it might support your theory that there is a difference, there's a relationship between two variables, but the bottom line is you can't say with that same degree of certainty that, okay, we did this experiment, caused a difference, or the relationship between these two variables is something other than just illusory, that one variable is causing another variable. And that's one of the things they point out with correlation, right? That correlation does not infer causality. Again, if we go back to the spurious correlation between Nicolas Cage movies and mass murders and mass shootings, yeah, correlation there. Is one causing the other? No. The misuse of this with some of the things that have happened in recent years with the legalization of cannabis for medical and recreational purposes, and people long saying that there was that cannabis was the gateway drug to crack, heroin, cocaine, meth, things like that. And they could put together a pretty good correlational case, but the bottom line was if you're going to say that that was a causative factor, some of the things that correlate higher with crack, heroin, meth, are going to be cigarettes, smokable tobacco, and alcohol, right? Of course, those two are socially acceptable and legal, so therefore we took that out of the equation and just looked at these others that had a high correlation. And then the other controversy that has come up over the years, and certainly recently with respect to something the Supreme Court ruled on recently, and that was abortion. And I kind of think that abortion is sort of an ethical issue. You don't argue one way or the other, perhaps based on science as much, or you don't make statements like, and this is what one side was and I'm not endorsing pro-life or pro-choice, that, irrelevant to the classroom here, but the idea that abortion caused breast cancer. And sure enough, there was a correlation between breast cancer and abortion. Okay. But then when you look deeper at that, you saw an even bigger correlation between poverty and women's access to health care and both abortion and breast cancer. Okay. So in the bigger picture, if you're going to say that there was a causative factor, and certainly we can't say there's a causative factor, but what correlationally is associated with breast cancer is poverty or access to health care. Well, the first thing we're going to deal with inferential statistics is this idea of, do we have something where we think it's a difference, it's just a random difference, or there's a non-random difference? So we talk about rejecting the null hypothesis if it looks like a non-random difference, and concluding that there's a real difference there, something non-random, something that we did, or some kind of association between two variables. Now, you can conclude this with non-experimental research, but the idea here that is that you have a variable makes a difference. It can be an association, but you can't also infer causality without doing the true experiment. Failed to reject the null hypothesis, conclude that you did not find a difference when in fact there was a difference. And we could talk about this in terms of type 1 and type 2 error. I'm going to give plain English definitions of these two. Okay, let's move this route. Okay, so if you're going to talk about type 1 error, you conclude that you have a significant relationship, a difference that's non-random, when in fact you got nothing. Okay. So the technical way of saying this is that false rejection of the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis should have been retained. Okay? Plain English, you think you got something, but you got nothing. Okay? Type 2 error. You don't think you have anything, or you retain the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis was false, or you had it and you missed it. Or fishing analogy. With this one, the fish is on the line, but the bobber doesn't go down. You don't detect it. So, missed it. And again, if you want to put this in technical language, type 1 error, a failure to reject the null hypothesis, or failure to failure to reject the null hypothesis, and falsely retaining the research hypothesis. Type 2 error, falsely retaining the null hypothesis, or falsely rejecting the research hypothesis. I think most of the time you're going to see this as stated in terms of what that null hypothesis is, because the idea is the null hypothesis is the default hypothesis. So in other words, with the type 1 error, failure to retain the null hypothesis, and with the type 2 error, failure to reject the null hypothesis. So table out of the book, null hypothesis, and the hypothesis is no difference, no change, no relationship. Decision failed to reject. Research hypothesis, change, or there's an association, or there's a difference. And you fail to retain the research hypothesis. Y'all with me so far? Is this?
Yeah.
Okay, this gets kind of convoluted when you state it. So, errors, and anytime we do any type of research, there's always going to be a probability that one or the other is going to be present. So in other words, if you find a significant difference, what that alpha level is literally telling you is what's the probability of a type 1 error. So in other words, your findings come up as being statistically significant at 0.05, okay? So you say, okay, there's a difference here. Well, what's the probability this is a type 1 error? Well, 0.05, multiply that by 100, about 5% probability that you got a type 1 error. Okay? Type 2 error, reject the null hypothesis when in fact when it's false, or failing to reject the null hypothesis when the research hypothesis is true. So this could also happen too, where you set that alpha level at 0.001, you set it up so it's going to be real stringent because you're more worried about making a type 1 error, but it inflates the probability of making a type 2 error. And then the way this is sometimes described, sins of commission, that is, you committed something, versus sins of omission, that you left something out or missed something, when in fact you actually had a difference. Okay. Any quick questions? Okay, for y'all watching this as video, there's going to be a discussion post for this week where you can post any questions you have about anything that was presented tonight in class.